If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. People, what are your true ghost, paranormal stories you like to tell on dark and stormy nights? I was walking my dog late at night, and there was this heavy fog over the area. From the top of the hill, you could see the fog had created a blanket 8 to 10 feet deep in the low areas, and it was a full moon, so it all lit up. It was like walking through a cloud. Along the way were a series of small ponds, and on the larger of the ponds, we didn't see anything. There was a hollow in the fog that was moving around like a huge creature. It moved towards us, and my dog just freaked out and first ran towards it, then away, and just went crazy. I could have sworn I saw something like eyes, and I just grabbed my dog and ran. It was 2 weeks before my dog would go anywhere near there. I have never seen fog like that before or since. When I was younger, I had a neighbor next door named Lexi, and she was my best friend. Our parents would go on trips on motorcycles with each other, and we would camp out at one of our houses until they came back. It was normal for us. We never had any paranormal events prior to this specific night. We were sitting in the bedroom, talking and doing what we normally do. We saw a bright light through her window, followed by the sound of motorcycles pulling onto the gravel driveway. We instantly think, okay, our parents forgot something, but before we could even get up to leave the bedroom, we heard a knock and a soft woman's voice say, "Hello?" The front door opened. This was a familiar sound because the door scraped against the hardwood flooring. We panicked, thinking there was an intruder at this point because this woman didn't sound like our family. We have very Texan voices. We scouted the house, scared out of our minds, only to find the front door wide open and nobody in the driveway. Nobody was in the house. We finally felt better. We walked back into her bedroom, but before she went to enter, she collapsed onto the floor and started sobbing. I didn't know what was happening. I was scared, and she told me something as tall as the door frame was standing in her parents' room. After our parents returned, her family continued to have paranormal activity in their house. They moved out too. During Hurricane Gustav, in 2008, I think, I evacuated to a church in Baton Rouge with a friend and his family. At the same time, there was an entire nursing home's worth of old people staying in the church. My friend, his family, and myself all shared one room together. In this church, there was one bathroom that was large, similar to something that would be in an elementary school, a few stalls, a trough urinal, etc. One night during the storm, my friend and I made a trip to the bathroom. The lights had since gone out, middle of a hurricane and all. The church had a musty, eerie feel to it. Kind of like when you turn out the AC in a house for a few days. The area surrounding the church was also dead quiet since there was no electricity in the area. The bathroom was several halls over from our room. So, we grabbed our flashlights and set out. While walking down one long hall, we shined our flashlights ahead, and there, at the end of the hall, sat an old man in a wheelchair, in the middle of the night with no one around. Now, this hall was incredibly long. So we could make him out, but we couldn't really see all his facial features, etc. Once we grasped what we saw, we turned and looked at each other, semi-freaked out. Then, we shined our flashlights back to where he was, and there was nothing there. It was as if he had vanished. No signs, no sound, nothing. Needless to say, we hauled our asses back to the room. 4 years ago, I was 22. I do a lot of various sports and used to switch from training for each one at different times, so I was 275 and bulking to powerlift at the time. The day was warm and largely uneventful. I was off work and had spent the day doing several workouts and eating in order to get in shape. But now, my body was sore and I had done everything for the day, so I was off to play Skyrim. I played from roughly 9:30 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. when I got a knock on my door. When I opened the door, nobody was there. I'm not jumpy, but something spooked me when I closed the door. I couldn't get comfortable, and I had the feeling something was there with me. I stood up to get water and was suddenly thrown to the ground the way I would be able to throw a 4-year-old. I threw my controller so hard that it broke and hit my head on the corner of the couch. I bled so much from that little cut. When I got back up, I called an ex-girlfriend of mine who was very spiritual and into these sorts of ghost happenings. She had me cleanse the place and declare very loudly that this was my house, and whatever it was had no right to the space. The second I was getting ready for bed, my power was cut. When I checked the breaker inside, it was fine. But the main breaker outside was opened and flipped off. I didn't think anything of it, but when I went back into my house, the feeling of unease hit me again. I called my friend, who said she could be over tomorrow. All I had really told her was that I was scared and felt a presence in my home. When she came over, She screamed after trying to look into it, saying she saw something 9 feet tall and with pale, glowing eyes that had never been human. She explained outside of my house that it could not pass thresholds without being let in, but it would not take no for an answer. I still live here, and it is still here with me. The worst that's happened since then is that glass bottles will shatter on the counter if left there for a few days or more. When I was about 15 years old, my grandmother died. We were really close, and I took her death pretty hard. She died on the toilet, and to make light of the situation, I would joke that she went out like Elvis. Well, a few days after she died, I was on the toilet when the bathroom lights turned off. Not a burned bulb. Something physically flipped the switch. As I sat there, I saw a faint blue light that looked as though it had shot out the window. I was kind of spooked, but welcomed all paranormal activity. When I walked out of the bathroom, my 5-year-old sister looked at me and said, "Grandma was just at the end of the bed, she told me to tell you, she said hi, and she is sorry for turning off the lights." I will never forget that moment. It is one of my favorite memories. My friend told me about all her ghost encounters within her home. I didn't believe her because I haven't experienced it at all. I've been living with her for almost 2 years now. About a week ago, I was sleeping. I had work that night, and she was at work herself. I was listening to my thunderstorm sounds to sleep better. After dozing in and out of sleep, I heard a child's voice. I couldn't tell their gender. My friend thinks it's a boy. I hear this child whisper right in my ear, "Wake up, we're going to be late." I shot up, my heart pounding so hard that it actually hurt. I've never experienced fear like that in my life. Somehow I managed to fall back asleep, but it was one of the most chilling things to happen in my life. I was about 16 at the time, out drinking with my girlfriend. It was about midnight, and we were walking back to my house. There were 2 ways to get there, a busy street and a long bike path through the woods, so we took the bike path. I was walking about 6 feet in front of her, and I got the feeling that something was watching us. It was like a bee sting somewhere I'd never felt before, and I just knew something bad was about to happen. In a split second, I heard it, a sound like someone forcing all the air from their lungs, and she screamed as I turned around to see her face plant on the cement. She asked me why I pushed her. She was mad, but she got confused when she realized I was ahead of her. I was not in arm's reach of her. She heard that loud breath scream right in her ear when something pushed her hard. We booked it back to the other route to my house, taking an extra hour to avoid that path through the woods. When she took off her shirt at my house, she had 2 bruises on her back. No one believed us, and we never walked that path at night again. A government health center hospital stands like a ruin. The scene here is scary due to the bushes and ruins. Even during the day, people are afraid to go down this path. Despite the thick bushes, the road looks like it has been cleaned by someone, while it is said that there is no cleaning there. Many times, people feel that there is a large crowd in the hospital and that there are voices of people crying. Not only this, but fear also comes from the fact that birds also do not sit on this ruin and its walls. The people of this village left that path deserted. If there is a lot of compulsion, then they form a flock and pass by. He is afraid all the time that there is no shadow of a ghost. The people of the village live like this. It is also claimed that in the middle of the night, there are sounds of owls crying. Listening to the sounds, it is as if someone has put the molten lead in the ear. At night, the villagers wait that somehow it is night and morning because the night of the village scares them. They live in panic at night. The people of the village say that it seems as if the night is not cut. It is also claimed that lights sometimes appear from the window of the hospital. There are sounds of moaning from there. If the people of the village believe that these voices have come for a long time, but no one has the courage to go and see them there, the people of the village say that on every second day, the sound of crying comes from the hospital, and on the second day, there is silence in the village. Everyone is scared in this village. I've lived in my apartment for 3.5 years now. A couple of days after I first moved in, I was in dire need of a nap, so I went ahead and passed out. I was awoken by someone blowing in my face. Mind you, I live alone. I got up a little shaken, looked around, and went about organizing the apartment. A few nights later, I was still getting situated when I glanced at the bathroom door and saw what seemed to be blood splatter, and then it faded. That's when it hit me that something really crazy had happened here. Let's backtrack a bit. I grew up in Bushwick, Brooklyn, born at the local hospital in 1973, and the apartment I was raised in until I moved out 3.5 years ago is haunted by a woman who was also murdered in that apartment by her abusive husband, as we were told by the owner of the building at that time. I've seen her, felt her, and heard her my entire upbringing in that apartment. She was very nice but lonely. My parents still live in the apartment, and whenever I come for a visit, I feel her presence. It's like a long-lost friend. So after realizing my new apartment is indeed haunted, some might ask, why do you stay? I stayed because living in New York is super expensive, and moving just wasn't an option. Slowly but surely, lots of things started happening in the apartment. I would hear whispers, someone calling my name, or feel like someone was standing by the kitchen sink staring at me. There are times when, as I shower, I know I am not alone. My niece and nephew come for a visit, and they will not go into the bedroom because they say there is a woman in the closet. Which is where I always feel someone watching me as I fall asleep. I saw her once. She is tall and slender with blonde hair, but she wasn't wearing any clothes, and she looked really sad. A few nights after I saw her, she whispered, "He followed me home from the park." I live 2 blocks away from Forest Park in Glendale, Queens. When I was around 7 years old, I shared a room with my younger sister. She got scared a lot at night and would wake up and go to sleep in our parents' room. We both had a twin-size bed with the head up against the wall and nothing on either side of the bed. One night after my sister had gone into our parents' room, I felt someone tapping my shoulder. I can't explain why I knew it was something bad. Something about the force of the tapping knowing I was a young girl. I pretended to be asleep and slowly pulled my blanket over my head. After a few seconds, I felt the tapping again. A little harder this time, but on the same part of the back of my shoulder. I peeked out from my blankets, and straight ahead of me, on the opposite wall, I saw a dim light. A large shadow of a man slowly walked by. I saw his shadow against the light. I remember his profile and how he had a large nose and a strong jaw. He seemed to slowly move across the room and then disappear. I was frozen. I couldn't move. Even after the light faded away and it was dark again, I sat there staring straight ahead in confusion and fear. I don't know. I was only 7, and even though I was well aware of spirits and such, I had never had a spirit make physical contact with me. I hid under my blankets again, curled up, and squeezed my eyes shut. I guess I fell asleep because, when I woke up again, it was morning. It's something I'll never forget. I can still picture him walking across my bedroom. Hands down one of the craziest ghost experiences I've had. Years later, I found out the people who lived in that house before us had painted the dining room black, so they held seances. Fun times. This story was told to me by my grandmother when I was a kid. I got a nasty scar on my knee from summer camp, so she told me the story of how she got a massive candy cane-shaped scar on her inner thigh. The year was 1944, and my grandmother was 16. She would walk to school and usually hop fences to shorten the trip. There was one fence that, if she could jump it, would certainly save her so much time. She tried, but she couldn't do it. She'd just have to hop the shorter fence to the left and walk all the way around the houses. Well, one day she was on her way home, jumping fences like normal. She jumps into the yard, where she would have to jump the shorter fence and walk around. She noticed a man dressed in an old-fashioned suit, she said a pinstriped one with a black hat, standing near the shorter fence. She was embarrassed for only a second when she saw that it was only half a man. He was solid at the top and faded out around his waist. She was so scared that she ran at the tall fence, jumped it, and ran all the way home. It was then that she noticed that her legs were covered in blood and her favorite skirt was ripped beyond repair. I miss my grandmother very much. Me and my 2 sisters always go on walks at night because we all find it calming, and it's mostly when our parents are hanging out with neighbors and getting drunk. There was this one time we asked our mom, who happened to be drunk, if we could go take a walk to our community pool and back. Keep in mind that it was around 11 o'clock at the time, but being dumb, we went anyway. When we were walking to the pool, me and one of my sisters realized how creepy it was, so I mentioned the weird feeling I had that we should turn back immediately. So we did. We had a choice, go the longer way, which is a street that goes up a big hill, or take the shortcut, which is a small hill slightly slanted. My sister suggested we go up the big hill so we get to walk a little longer, and I agreed until I looked up the big hill and saw a tall, large figure standing in a dark street with only the brightness of a street light at least 10 feet from the figure. Then I got the feeling that we should turn back and come up again. I freaked out and shouted, "No! We need to go the other way now." My sisters were both confused as to why I suddenly wanted to go the other way. So I told them what I saw, and they happened to see the slightest bit of the figure. They both freaked themselves out about being in the back rooms, and when I glanced at the figure, it's gone. My sister's eyes immediately don't see it either. That's when we get truly freaked out and run the whole way back without stopping. We made it home safely, and we all agreed never to go on night walks again. I grew up in a haunted house. We had this toy car that would move on its own with no batteries in it. And I mean, move like 30 feet and go in circles. Sometimes it would just move for hours. My entire family saw it, and we even had uncles and aunts come over to see it. In that same house, we got the hardwood floors done, and we woke up to these 3 bird-like claw marks all over the floor and house. My mom bought a plant once too, from a garage sale. When she brought the plant home, I had a dream about breaking the plant, and in the dream, my mom was angry that I had broken the plant. When I awoke, my mom said she saw a figure standing beside her bed all night, and the plant had been destroyed as well. She tossed the plant out, and that figure or dream never happened again. It was very common to see black shadows in broad daylight, and I remember one night when I was like 4, I woke up to 2 giant glowing red eyes inches in front of my face. Yeah, that house was haunted as duck. My grandpa passed away from lung cancer when I was still in elementary school. I don't remember much about him, but we lived in the same house in Puerto Rico, so it was kind of weird not having him around. My grandma stayed with us for a while after his death. She eventually moved away, but this happened while she still lived with us. We had somebody that cleaned the house, and she was, to say the least, weird. We'll call her Anna. Anna claimed she was a medium, but we never believed her. She always walked around with this thing she'd call alcoholado, and yeah, she was odd. But one day, my mom was at the house with Anna and with my grandma. My grandma was upstairs, my mom was in the living room, and Anna was in my mom's room. My mom heard shouting coming from her room and walked over to see Anna yelling at the wall. My mom said she kept repeating things like leave. It's not her time yet. Get out of here, you get the gist. My mom was freaked out. I mean, I'm sure it was a sight to be seen. She kept yelling and then looked at my mom and yelled, "Go check on your mom, your dad is here to take her." And my mom told me every hair on her body stood up straight. So my mom ran up the stairs to find my grandma on the floor of her bathroom. She had just had a stroke. Luckily, she was rushed to the hospital, and she is still well to this day. Anna saved my grandma's life. But here's the weirdest part, that was the last time we ever saw Anna. She was very old and didn't have a phone or any sort of communication. If my parents ever wanted to talk to her, they would go to her house. So after the incident, my mom went to check on her, and she had moved. Is that not weird? That's what scares me the most. Who the duck was she? Where the hell is she? My first duty station was built in the mid-1950s. There are a couple lodging buildings that are from that era, and then a newer lodging building that was finished in 2012. I stayed in one of the old buildings for a few months. I have sleep paralysis every once in a while, but usually I'm not super terrified. I was having a dream that a figure with long white hair over their face was standing over or behind my shoulder. In the darkness, I opened my eyes and saw something light or white colored over me. I was nervous and asked, "Can I help you?" Then I realized it was the lampshade. So fast forward, I was talking to a coworker of mine, and he mentions he had a few paranormal experiences in both the old and newer lodging buildings. He said that while he was in one of the old buildings, he was taking a nap. He woke up to burning pain on his legs, pulled the blankets back, and said he had fresh scratches with beads of blood coming out, like a cat scratch. There was nothing under the blankets. Another time, while he was in the new building, he was in bed, dozing off or about to fall asleep. It sounds like another instance of sleep paralysis, but he dreamed he got out of bed and looked towards the front door. He said he saw an old woman with long white hair covering her face standing in front of the door inside his room. He blinked his eyes, and in an instant she was face to face with him. She slowly raised her arm, pointed at the mirror on the wall, and whispered, "That's how we go from room to room." I grew up in an area that used to be a Potawatomi Sioux and French fur trading village. This history is relevant. Outside of town, just down the road from my grandma's house, was a clearing in the woods, on top of a hill, right near a spring. When I was a kid, my dad chose to situate a single-story ranch-style prefab house in that clearing, and we moved into it when I was maybe 12 or 13 years old. The weirdness started right away. Within a few days of moving in, when we were all watching a movie in the living room, we heard a loud bang, like a gunshot, in the kitchen. When we went to see if something had fallen over, though, nothing was out of place. Then came the silhouettes that would walk behind us in our reflections, always in the kitchen windows. After that, there were footsteps on the roof. Always after midnight, pacing slowly from one end of the house to the other, like someone keeping watch. I think I was the only person who ever heard those, since everyone else was usually asleep by then. Sometimes I would go out onto the back porch to see if anyone was up there, but of course there never was. Finally, it all came to a head when I was 16. It was late, and I was shutting everything down for the night, turning off all the lights room by room as I headed to my bedroom. I stopped in the kitchen just long enough to get a cup of water, then turned off that light. At this point, only the hallway light and my bedroom light were on. I was taking a drink as I headed into the dining room, and when I lowered the cup, I saw a person standing in front of me, and I stopped. It was another girl who looked about my age. She had long blonde hair that was wild and messy, like she'd just rolled out of bed and come running, and she was wearing a dingy, whitish Civil War era nightgown, and she had blue eyes that were open wide in sheer terror. I don't know if she was looking at me or at someone who had once been standing in that exact same spot, but she clearly saw someone or something that had terrified her. Then I blinked, and she was gone. Some years later, after I'd half forgotten the incident, I was reading up on my hometown's history. I'd already known about the Potawatomi village. Site of a former Potawatomi Indian village has been on the town's billboard for longer than I can remember, but I hadn't known about the French traders. Nor had I known that, after the Civil War, indigenous peoples and French folk alike were rounded up and forcibly relocated by the U.S. Army so that the land could be seized by the government and redistributed to the soldiers as payment for their service during the war. And I thought about our convenient little clearing in the woods, and the footsteps on the roof in the middle of the night, and the shadows, and the gunshot, and the girl. And I couldn't help but wonder. When I was in high school, my friends and I used to go to Black Snake Road to race each other. It was in a very rural area, had little traffic, and was very dark. We called it that because of several hairpin turns. However, there was a perfect half mile that was marked by a bridge on one end and a train track on the other. One night, after several of us had been racing, I found that I was the last to leave. As I approached the bridge, I saw a girl standing there, dripping wet. I stopped and asked if she was okay, and she responded that her boyfriend missed the bridge and crashed into the water. She said that he was still in the truck. I got out of my car. That is when the story got even stranger. The lady told me that her daughter, Sally, had been dead for over 30 years. She had drowned when her boyfriend missed the bridge and flipped his truck, trapping her inside. Surprised and not thinking very clearly, I insisted that she come to my car, which she did, slippers, housecoat, and all. The passenger side window was rolled down, which Sally had done. My old Malibu had crank windows. They were a pain to roll down, and I could not reach the handle from the driver's seat. There was a puddle in the passenger seat, but no Sally. The lady asked me to walk across the road to the graveyard next to the church. We did, and she showed me Sally's grave. Ghosts are real. My friend went to a campsite over the weekend, and when she got back, she told me everything while completely shaking. She was staying at a campground in Burns, Tennessee. She told me that the cabins were separated from each other, and everywhere in the distance were trees. Each night, there would always be twigs breaking, but she couldn't see them because they were completely pitch black. She told me that she's a light sleeper, but not even the most quiet noise can wake her up, which she thought was very strange. The last night she was staying at that campground, she was asleep like always, but then she woke up to more twigs breaking, but it sounded almost like that thing was right at her window. She jumped out of bed, grabbed her phone, turned on her flashlight, and looked through the window. She couldn't see anything, so she decided to open the front door to the cabin. As soon as she was about to tell me the rest of the story, she started crying. It took a while for me to get her to tell me the rest of what happened, but after a while, she was finally able to tell me the rest of her experience. She told me that as soon as she opened the front door, she flew back to the floor, saying to herself, "Why was this thing here at this cabin every night while I was staying here?" She stood up, slammed the door shut, and quickly locked it. She told me that as soon as she got back from that trip, she'd been waking up at 3 a.m. every night. After that experience, she started seeing glowing white eyes and a huge smile. She always turns on the lights in her room. Every night, before she goes to bed, she thinks about that smile, saying to herself, "Who was that, and why was I their target?" The next day, we started doing research. None of that stuff had anything to do with the experience my friend went through. This is a true story. I was walking with my buddies to another friend's house around 1 a.m. one night. We had been drinking a bit, but the night was young, and we were carrying on elsewhere and making our way down a long county road that was adjacent to some wide open fields that extended off into a distant forest. It was a clear moonlit night, and I remember feeling very clear-headed and enjoying the night air as we walked. As we walked along, I was casually drinking in the scenery in a way you only can at 1 a.m. on a cool moonlight night and looking off into a field. As I slowly scanned the area, I noticed something extremely dark, maybe 150 meters away. While the whole field was practically shining with moonlight, with light cloud patterns throwing bits of shade, this thing was as black as could be. It looked like a mass of obsidian, Vanta black, that was low to the ground. It was like something had an impossibly black blanket or shroud tossed over it, and it seemed to be very slowly moving in a drifting, shuffling kind of manner. I remember staring at it for 5 long seconds before I felt like I was jolted and realized I was looking at something very wrong. As the moonlight swept across the field and moved and the clouds played across the field, this thing was just there, looking like a total absence of light, just pure blackness shuffling slowly low to the ground. I watched it with shocked fascination until we walked past the field, and I lost it. I felt like I was too stunned to say anything and only brought it up when we got to my friend's house. All my friends ribbed me, laughed at me, and said I was skunked for seeing SHT in the dark and that I didn't see anything. They didn't even let me describe what I saw. I pretty much got out that I saw some ducked up shit in the field, and they were like, leave it alone, man, we don't need that tonight. A few minutes later, my friend GF came over to me and quietly said that she saw something strange too, that she saw something very, very black that looked incredibly strange and out of place. I told her I saw the same thing and thanked her for making me feel sane, and we never ended up talking about it again. Nowadays, when I think about it, I'm like, what could that possibly have been? Some kind of alien with a cloaking shroud? A night or forest spirit just spooking out in the field? I just can't think of anything to describe it. The whole field around it, in front of it and behind it, was lit with bright, sweeping moonlight, and this thing was just completely and utterly black, like a void. What the hell was it? I have witnessed many paranormal things. One of them that sticks out the most is the night after my dad passed away. He was a true believer in the paranormal, and he was very superstitious. Bad things would always happen to him on Friday, the 13th. He just so happened to die on Friday, the 13th. He would often joke that when he died, he would come back and haunt people. Well, my sister, mom, and I were sitting at the kitchen table the night after his death when, all of a sudden, the cabinet next to the table flung open with great force. We all kind of looked at each other and were like, there's no way. So my sister went over to the cabinet and shut the doors. That particular cabinet had been painted over many times, and the doors were really hard to open. My sister pulled on the doors to make sure they were closed well. A few minutes later, the cabinet flung open again. I'm pretty sure it was my dad messing with us. Those cabinet doors had never done that before, and they haven't done it since. My husband and my 2-year-old daughter had moved into a semi-new apartment complex. I was a stay-at-home mom. I first noticed that the lights flickered in the hallway and that the TV would turn off on its own. I always felt uneasy being alone in the apartment. It felt dark, although it had lots of windows and plenty of light during the daytime. One very early morning, at the break of dawn, I heard a jingling of tags from a pet. Something jumped onto the bed, did circles on my comforter, and laid down by my legs. I grew up with a dog sleeping with me and thought, the dog is asleep now, but we don't have a dog. I bolted up, nothing was there. I thought it was a dream. I decided to switch bedrooms with our daughter, as she had the larger one. One night in the other bedroom, I was asleep early in the morning again, and the covers kept being tugged down on me. I am always cold and a light sleeper, and I finally woke up, and the covers were moving on their own. My husband woke up and saw it too. They were being pulled down on us. I didn't go back to sleep that morning, either. A couple of weeks later, I had a dream where someone said, "Do you want to see a ghost?" I said sure and got out of bed and walked into the living/dining area. I looked to the right and noticed our apartment was filled with old antique furniture and decorated with someone else's things. Confused, I turned my head to the left dining area and saw an old gray woman crouched over what appeared to be a desk. We had a dining table set there. She turned her head and glared angrily at me, scaring the shit out of me, and I woke up. I was rattled for days. A month or so later, we were sitting outside talking to the upstairs neighbors, a mother and daughter. She went on to say that the former tenant in our apartment was an elderly woman who was a piano teacher, but they made her stop having students in the apartment because of the traffic in the parking lot taking up parking spaces and noise from the piano playing. She also said she was an extremely angry old woman and that she had died in the apartment. I froze and said, "Did she have a little dog that died there too?" She said, "Yes, she did," with a puzzled look on her face, like, "How did you know that?" I didn't even go into my experiences because no one ever believes you and writes off these experiences as sleep paralysis or something else. But the apartment was haunted. We were only there for a year and moved. I never saw the old woman again. One of my first ghost experiences was when I was about 9 to 11 years old. A relative of ours has passed away. After she passed, her family gave me a dresser of hers. She kept her stuff in immaculate condition. Well, when I was sleeping, I saw her standing at the foot of my bed. The next morning, I told my mom, She didn't say too much about it then. But then the next night, she was there again. I told my mom about her again the next day, and she told me the only way to find out if something is real or not is to touch it. So, this is now the third night I see her standing at the foot of my bed, so I sit up so slowly, she is still there. I put one foot out of bed, I look, and she is still there. I put the other foot on the bed. I'm now sitting on the edge of the bed, turning and looking, and I can still see her. She's just standing there, staring at me. I can see everything. She had gray hair put up, with a few strands hanging down. One of her nostrils was smashed in. She had a long white nightgown on. I could see everything, just like any other person standing there, so now I stand up and I'm facing her, and she's still there. I start walking towards her really slowly because I'm scared to death. She's still there. I put my hand out to touch her. I was probably only about an inch away from her. I can see everything. I can see veins in her hands. I can see wrinkles. I can see everything. I freaked out and ran through the closet. The only thing separating my room from my parents' room was the clothes hanging in the closet because they were not finished yet. I jumped on my parents' bed screaming and yelling, telling them she was real. The next morning, I saw my dad outside burning the dresser. This is really strange for him because he was a pretty thrifty man and he would not destroy anything that was so good, but after he burned the dresser, I never saw her again. My brother once lived in a flat in the downtown of Mount Clemens, Michigan. The Clem was known to be a hot spot for baths back in the Depression era and was booming with activity. Nowadays, it has some rundown parts. This is where my brother rented his flat. It was a giant old ragged house that was now separated into multiple odd apartments. Anyway, long story short, he always admitted to odd experiences, cabinet doors opening up, things missing, but one peculiar oddity was that he was always missing boxers and underwear from his drawer. He admitted that he thought his house was haunted and that the ghost had a crush on him. Never anything violent or disturbing, just odd things. Later on, he starts dating his future ex-wife. She starts coming around, and he notices that the oddities begin to increase. New oddities began to occur. His girlfriend would always find her shoes, which were left on a mat inside the apartment, outside the door on the patio in the morning. She'd always tell my brother to stop putting her shoes outside. He had an idea of why but didn't want to frighten her. Besides, it wasn't hurting anyone, right? Well, things started getting worse. He comes home from work, and his girlfriend, who was staying there while he was gone, claims that the stove burner kept lighting itself. She'd walk into the kitchen, and it would be lit. She'd turn it off, and shortly later it'd be lit again. Then, one night, my brother wakes up in the middle of the night and sees his girlfriend sitting at the end of the bed. He not only sees but also feels her near his feet, staring at him. He calls out for her to come back to bed, but she doesn't respond, so he calls out louder, telling her to come to bed and asking what's wrong. His girlfriend then asks what he's doing. He turns, and she's sleeping next to him. He turns back, no one is at the end of the bed. Now, he's freaked out but doesn't want to scare his girlfriend from coming over to his place. A few nights later, they're both sleeping, and he wakes up to his girlfriend screaming. He looks over, and she's sleeping but thrashing around, holding onto her neck. He doesn't see anything, so he starts yelling and shaking her to wake her up. After a few shakes, she wakes up crying and terrified. She starts telling my brother about how real her dream felt, that a woman was strangling her, telling her to get out, that she doesn't belong there, and to leave her man alone. Her neck had red marks on it, possibly from herself trying to defend herself, but they believed it to be from something else. My brother then comes clean with her, and they decide to do some research and find out that the address that they live in was an old brothel back in the day that the rich bathers used to stay in. My brother lived in that house for a few more weeks before he could locate a new place. She never came back to stay the night, and he never experienced anything aggressive while there. Still, kind of ducked up though. I know my brother, and I can tell when he's lying. This SHT was legit, and when she talked about it, you could see how shaken up she was. In 7th grade, my friends and I went over to Mary's house intent on playing with her mom's Ouija board that night. None of us had played with one before. Mary's mom was an extremely spiritual person who believed in energies, witchcraft, and stuff like that. Before we used the board, Mary warned us that her mom would be really pissed if she found out that we were playing with it because Ouija boards can attract bad spirits into the home. With full knowledge of this, we decided to proceed anyway. This Ouija board was not like the shower curtain all the way closed and facing in my direction. We all screamed and promised our friendships that we had not moved them ourselves, a very important promise. I felt like I was being watched, and my friends thought so too. It was only 4 of us, and I believe with all my heart that none of them had moved it because we were all too nervous to do anything. I'll never use a Ouija board again because of how crazy and intense that night was. I understand that people say Ouija boards are controlled by your subconscious, but duck that. I know I felt something in that room with us. I knew it was ducking dangerous. I had been to the Gettysburg battlefield many times and had always heard great ghost stories about the place, but I had never had a similar experience, and I was getting increasingly suspicious that these stories might be fictional. Nonetheless, finding myself in Gettysburg one evening, I decided to drive around the battlefield and see if my ghost hunting luck might improve. It was a good night for this activity, being clear and warm with a near full moon providing lots of light as I drove towards Culp's Hill, where the organized ghost tours never seemed to go. I drove slowly down the road with my arm out the window, noting the pale gray monuments that lined the roadway, when, as I rounded a turn, my headlights illuminated a distinctly different monument. This one had a top half that was dark and a lower half of a lighter color, which reminded me of a Union soldier's navy blue coat and light blue trousers. Then, as I got closer, it actually turned to face my car. That's when I saw that it actually was a navy blue sack coat and light blue trousers, completely three-dimensional, but with no visible person inside the clothing. There seemed to be just a very pale, illuminated oval above the coat collar where a face would be, but nothing else, not even shoes, so the bottom of the trousers didn't reach the ground. As I noted this, it began walking slowly towards the open driver's side window of my car. As it casually walked towards me, with empty sleeves swinging at its side and empty pant legs taking step after step without quite touching the ground, my stomach tied itself in knots and my mind raced through a million thoughts at once. And not just the obvious ones, like, what does it want? What will it do? Why me? No, I also thought those clothes looked absolutely real, and the weave of the wool was just like the ones in the museum, and if I could make my hand move, I could touch it, and it would feel as real as my t-shirt and jeans. Then, as it got within inches of the car, one thought broke my paralysis: it's going to climb right through the window, over the top of me, and into the car. That was the motivation I needed to find the accelerator and go, and as I did, the apparition disappeared as if it had never been. I raced back to the comfort of streetlights and people in town as fast as I could, but I no sooner got there than I wished I had stayed more rational and maybe tried to communicate with the spirit. Still, this had been the perfect way to convince me of ghosts. It didn't look like a ghost I had ever imagined, plus the moonlight was so bright that I could clearly see the details, and with no wires or tree limbs overhead to suspend it and the bottom of the legs not touching the ground, I couldn't think of any way it could have been faked. I called my wife at home the next morning and told her I officially believed in ghosts. My mother and 2 older brothers would visit my aunt and 3 cousins around Christmas. Anyway, they lived up near Inverness in Scotland, in a place called the Black Isle. It's actually in a place called Cromarty. We all rented out a holiday home just down the road from my cousin's house. It had multiple bedrooms in it, so it was perfect for a lot of guests. Me, one of my older brothers, and his friend from Africa were all staying in one room. They were fast asleep. I, however, was not. I woke suddenly, and I didn't know why. I scanned the room with my bleary eyes. It was very dark, and I couldn't hear anything but the snores from my brother and his friend. The door to the room slowly opened with a creak. I swear to God. I froze with fear. I didn't see anything enter through it. But, as I tried to scan my eyes around the room, I started to see shadow-like figures pulsating and hovering around the 2 adjacent beds, hovering and pulsating over my brother and his friend. There must have been at least 3 of these figures. The third one stood over my bed. Although this apparition didn't have any human-like features, except maybe the shape of something human, I could feel like it was staring right at me. I decided then that the only course of action was to turn over, face the wall, and go to sleep. The morning after, I told my experiences to a few of my family members, and they joked that it might be witches that performed those rituals in the past and generally didn't believe me, except one person, my brother's girlfriend. She told me she experienced something as well. She was only sleeping next door, and she told me she felt like someone sat down on the end of her bed in the night and said she could feel the weight of someone on her legs, but nothing was there. Very frightened by this, I decided to read the guest book to see if anyone else reported anything else weird and unusual, but nothing of the sort was there. I'll never forget what I saw that night, and if you're ever up near the Black Isle or stay in the same holiday home I did, just be aware of any strange figures entering your room at night. My mom bought the Ouija board from Toys R Us as a fun game to play with my friends. My friends wanted to contact Bloody Mary, both on the Ouija board and in the mirror. But everyone was too chicken shit to stay to see if anything would appear in the mirror, and they ran out. That day, we went to the beach in the crystal blue water, where you could clearly see the sand below. I came out of the water, and there were several red claw marks, like fingernails, going down my entire body, from my neck down to my arms and legs. The weird thing is, I didn't feel the burn of these scratch marks until I exited the ocean and noticed them. I lined up my nails with these scratch marks, and they looked like they could have come from a human. My uncle, who was with us, said, "I must have scratched myself on a rock or something." I said there were no rocks. Then he said maybe a fish. Kids at school started spreading this story, and I was asked if the Bloody Mary story was true. I didn't want to answer them, in part because maybe my uncle was right, but I didn't fully know. But after several times of the kids begging me to answer, I just nodded my head yes and didn't say anything more. I threw my Ouija board away in the outdoor trash, expecting it to reappear in my room. Later, my mom said she saw it in the outdoor trash, so she returned it. "Gee, thanks, Mom, I'm scared of it." My friends and I played it again. The board liked doing figure-8 patterns between questions. One time we asked the spirit how old it was, and it said 0. My young teen friend thought it was from her miscarriage, so she even played it by herself. I know, freaky right? But part of me thought it was fake. Days later, doors in my house started opening and slamming completely shut, repeatedly. My mom said it must be the wind. No windows were open for that to happen. I even checked to see if there was something wrong with the doors, like they were loose or something, but they weren't. It made no sense. Once it was completely shut, you would have to turn the doorknob for it to reopen. So how did it reopen by itself after it was slamming shut? The TV turned on and off by itself every time my mom and I got into a heated argument. When we yelled at each other, the TV turned off on its own. My mom always thought it was my fault and yelled at me, and I yelled back at her, pointing to the remote, and said that it was nowhere near me, it was closer to her. Then, when we were finally quiet, the TV would turn back on. We didn't exchange words when this phenomenon happened, and we parted ways. The final straw at home to make me feel like there was definitely something supernatural going on was: I am in my bedroom, late at night, not a worry in the world. My lights are on. I'm watching a family-friendly show called Green Acres. I felt something like a heavy sumo wrestler jump on my bed. My body bounced from this. I thought, don't panic, there might be a logical reason. I looked at the last foot of my bed, and it was sunken in. Then I saw sunken marks crawling up to my thigh. I jumped up and screamed, running to my mom's room. She told me I was not allowed to sleep with her. She said she doesn't care where I slept but can't be in her room. She then confessed that thing crawls into her bed, she tells it to go away, and she can feel it crawl out of her bed, respecting her wishes. She said, all I have to do is tell it to go away, and it has to respect my wishes. That night, I slept in the living room, but after that, I returned to sleeping in my room. There were many nights without incidents, but I kept saying out loud, go away, repeatedly because I was super scared. Many years later, I moved back home for a short stay with my firstborn, who was a young toddler. While my daughter was in a crib, outside of her crib, her toys went off in the middle of the night, lighting up and making noise. My mom played it off and said, oh, the batteries must be dying for it to go off on its own. I think I like believing whatever my mom tells me to reduce my fears. My ghost stories didn't start until that damn Ouija board. I have warned my kids never to play with a Ouija board and told them my stories. I told them it invites ghosts into your home, but you might not be able to get rid of them. This happened to my sister and me when I was 7 or 8. My sister is 2 years younger than me. Now we live in Australia, so basements aren't a thing. But sometimes really old houses might have a wine cellar. The house we lived in was built in the 1940s, maybe even earlier. It was an old brick house with a strange layout. The rooms just felt off to me, like the flow of the house felt wrong, and even the rooms felt like they were in the wrong spots. We had a wine cellar underneath the house, which we accessed through the backyard. One section was open, and the west side had a wall that was built with bricks with holes in them so light would filter through during the daytime. The rest of the cellar was like a big underground room or rooms. You could stand up and walk further into the adjoining room in the cellar, which led to a smaller opening into the brick wall that an adult could crawl through. Once in here, it led to each individual room under the house, so any electrical problems could be fixed. Also, the inside floors were heated, which was great in the winter. Yes, it does get cold in Australia in the winter. This house was always cold and made me feel uncomfortable and scared as soon as the sun went down. My sister and I have experienced a few things in this house, as has my dad. However, this particular incident was absolutely terrifying. My sister and I were playing in our cellar with our dog. We looked up, and in the darker area of the cellar stood a figure. It was a male, and he was looking at us, not saying anything. Now I can't speak for my sister, but I had the most overwhelming sense of fear and absolute dread fill my body. My chest was tight, and I was frozen with fear. We knew what we were looking at was evil and not human. The figure looked at us. He started to walk further into the darkness in the cellar, then turned back to look at us again. He moved his head as if he were trying to beg us to follow him. He gave us a terrifying grin as he looked at us. I was so afraid. We knew it was evil, we could feel the heaviness of his presence in the cellar. I'm not sure how long we stood there for, I just wanted it to be over. Then my little sister grabbed me, and we ran out of there and up the footpath back into our house, screaming and crying to Mom and Dad, telling them what had happened. I remember Dad running out there to look around, but he found nothing. I still have nightmares about that house, like I'm trapped. It was one of the most terrifying things I've ever experienced. I also never went back into the cellar again. I grew up in a farm town, and the only place to get groceries besides the grossly overpriced Shopko on the edge of town was the family-owned supermarket, Robertson's. The Robertson family was very active in the community but also had a reputation ranging from miserly to straight-up evil, depending on who you asked. If you asked me and the rest of the Bag Boys, Robertson's had a dark aura around it. Many features contributed, like the vaulted ceilings in the back rooms, the creaking floors in the upstairs offices, and the door hidden behind a pile of old shelves that seemed to lead under the loading dock. The worst was the patriarch of the Robertsons, Blaine. He was too old to handle the business decisions, but he was too stubborn to let his toupee-toting son take it out of his hands, so he spent his days shuffling around the floor, antagonizing the Bag Boys at every turn. He'd chastise us for clocking in more than 1 minute early. He'd chastise us for standing at the clock with a minute left in our shift. He'd chastise us for our laziness the second we weren't actively moving items. I always joke that Blaine was a vampire. He just refuses to die. Why else is there never a call over the intercom for kids who lost their parents? One night, my suspicions were reinforced. Blaine had shown up at about 9 to take care of some office work upstairs. With all of our closing duties done, my partner for the night and I lollygagged in the stock room, right at the foot of the office stairs. When 10 rolled around and it was time to close, I figured I'd let Blaine know we were locking up. I started up the stairs and suddenly noticed it was dark. I got to the top and looked around. Not a single light in the offices was on. We had stood at the bottom of the stairs the whole time, and Blaine hadn't passed us. Even when Blaine is male and female. He was taking his dinner break when he heard a baby crying from the women's bathroom. He had been in there for 5 minutes already and hadn't seen anyone come in, much less a baby. He endured the crying for 5 more minutes before he got concerned and knocked on the door. Repeated knocks and questions got nothing back except for the non-stop bawling. He was finally convinced something had happened to the mother and cracked the door open. The room was dark and empty. This didn't happen to me, but to my mother. Technically, it did happen to me, as she was pregnant with me when it happened. When my mom was still married to my biological father, they lived in Pensacola, Florida. He was an actor at the time, and his troupe performed at the Senger Theater. My mom wasn't allowed to drive due to being very familiar with me, so he would have to do all the driving. She would often get stir-crazy and suffer cabin fever, so she made him take her with him to dress rehearsals. My mom eventually took it upon herself to help out in the rehearsals. While the actors practiced their lines, the orchestra rehearsed their music, and so on, my mom would move around the theater, taking notes. She would write down any issues she encountered when sitting in different sections of the house, like if a prop or piece of a set blocked the view of an actor from one angle. If one actor's mark happened to obstruct the view of another actor on their mark from another angle, or if the orchestra's performance of Heaven on Their Minds made it difficult to hear Judas singing. At the end of the rehearsal, she would pass her notes along to the director and producer, who would then pass them on to the proper people. During one particular rehearsal, my mom was sitting up on the balcony and proceeded to head back to the main level. The lights were still down, so it was pretty dark, and as she was 7 or 8 months pregnant, she couldn't see her feet. She missed a step and nearly fell forward when she felt something grab her right arm and pull her backward. It had a very tight grip on her arm, and it began to pull at her, urging her to go ahead. She proceeded down the steps, noticing the grip not releasing at all. When she got to the landing on the main level, she turned to thank whoever pulled her up, but nobody was there. There were no marks, no bruising, and nothing to show her arm was grabbed. I had a time, probably around 7 to 8 years old, when my cousin, neighbor, mom, and I were all sitting on the same couch chatting. No TV or radio was on. There were only a couple lamps to light the living room. My mom decided to get up to fix herself another drink in the kitchen. Upon her return, she asked, talking to me, "Why did you put your feet on the ceiling?" I couldn't have possibly put my feet on the ceiling. I'm 5 feet 3 inches as an adult, and I looked up to see one full set of an adult male's footprints on my ceiling. My cousin was the only one that could have done it, and she was still not tall enough to put just a single set on the ceiling. All four of us saw them, and we watched them. After about 10 minutes of staring at them, it seemed they had moved. To test this, we marked the ceiling with a pen, probably about a foot away from the prints. I have no idea how long we watched them for, but eventually they crossed that line. My mom wiped them away after that, and they never came back. To this day, 10 plus years later, I cannot explain what I saw, and my mother and cousins still clearly remember this day. When I was 8, my friend Annie and I were at her house. It was over the summer, so everyone else had left for work or a meeting, so we were home alone. Mind you, Annie lives near a farm, so there's a field behind her house. Anyway, we were in her room, and her cat ran down the hall out of her grandparents' room. We were very confused, as he looked freaked out. We got up from the bed and went over to him, and she picked him up and started petting him. He was very sketched out, but we didn't think anything of it. Before I continue, her mom's room is at the beginning of the hall, and her grandparents' room is at the end of the hall. Her mom and grandparents always leave their doors open because of the cats. In her grandparents' room, there's a mirror in the middle of the wall, so when you step out of my friend's room, come down the hall, or stand in her mom's room at the door, you obviously see your reflection. Annie and I started to get hungry, so she decided to go get a snack for us. She went to the kitchen, and I stood with the cat in the hallway, just petting him as he lay on the floor in front of Annie's mom's room. I noticed a train of white dresses go by from one end of her grandparents' room to the other. Annie came back, and I told her what just happened, and we went to get up to go in the living room and down the hall. In her grandma's mirror, we saw a tall woman in a bridal gown, no eyes, a wide smile, and her head tilted as she stood right behind us in the reflection of the mirror. She let out the most bone-chilling scream, and we booked it and headed to the basement to see if anyone had snuck in down there. We noticed no windows were broken or door handles were broken. As we reached the doors to head into the garage area, we froze when we heard high heels coming down the stairs and the creepiest giggles ever. We got into the garage and ran for our lives. We stayed outside until someone came home, which wasn't until 3 in the afternoon. Annie's mom came home, and we didn't even give her a chance to get out of her car as we began to tell her what had happened. She was freaked out a bit, as she told me, as that woman had always bothered her when she was our age. As she told us this story, we all had to rush inside because we heard a howl and laughter coming from the cornfield. The night after that was just as terrifying as it was for me in the middle of the night. It was around 4 in the morning, and I had to pee badly. So I got up and went. I shut the door like anyone else probably would, and I did my business. As I was finishing, I heard scratching outside the door, and I thought it was just a cat. Annie's cats were literal crackheads at night. As I went to grab some toilet paper, I saw a human eye under the door peeking in at me. I screamed and cried, with her mom rushing in. I told her what happened, and she thought it'd be best if Annie and I slept with her for the night. The weird thing about this story is that this woman came out of nowhere. I was friends with Annie since kindergarten, and we never experienced that stuff before. Even after that happened, and as we grew older, that woman never came around, as if she never existed. Annie and I never talk about it, but when someone brings it up, we look at each other and leave the room. It will forever send shivers down our spines. We're both 21 now. When I was around 15, my family and I moved into a 3-bedroom house. My older sister chose the bigger bedroom, and I didn't really care much at the time. I got the smaller room down the hall, which kind of looked creepy since there was a window right at the end of the hallway, and my bedroom would be on the side of where the window was. So when you go out of the room, on your right, you'll see a small window on the wall next to me where the hallway ends. As I was getting my stuff into my bedroom, I saw something odd, which looked like a nail, on the windowsill. I ignored it and just went back into my new room. Little did I know that this house was previously owned by a crazy old woman who had died in it. My parents told me this after things started to get worse. So, anyway, as I unpacked everything and sorted my stuff, I felt a cold breeze come out of nowhere. Mind you, it was a freaking summer and very hot during that time. Out the corner of my eye, I saw a black figure unmoving right where the window was. I was 6 to 7 feet away from it because I was in my room. During this time, I froze and felt tingles down my spine. I quickly ran downstairs to my parents and didn't have the words to explain what just occurred. After calming down for a bit, I told them about the black figure, and my father went upstairs with me to check up on it, but he said, "You're not a child anymore, Sky." I felt hurt because he thought I was playing around with him. He then checked everywhere, my room and the window close by, but there was nothing. A few hours went by, and we were all eating dinner. My older sister was in a bad mood and was texting her friends at the table, which she always used to do. I was the talkative one whenever it was time to eat dinner with my family, but in reality, I'm an introverted girl. So, I was asking how Dad's day went. He works as a construction worker, and he said it was okay. Suddenly, we heard a loud thump coming from upstairs. You could kind of see the hallway because that's where the stairs led up to, and downstairs is where the dining area was next to the kitchen. My dad then asked, "What was that?" in a concerned tone. He got up from the dining table and grabbed his old bat that he always kept in the kitchen if we were ever in danger. He slowly made his way upstairs and heard more sounds. Thump thump thump. It got louder, and I was scared as shit as daylight. He went to the final step and went to stand in front of my room. He also looked to the side where the window was outside in the hallway. No one was there, but sounds came mostly from my room. He tried opening the door, but it was locked? How could that be? I never lock it, and there is no key to lock it or anything that makes it look it was an old doorknob. My dad began to push all his body against the door, and it finally opened so hard that he nearly fell over. I wanted to see what the commotion was about, and I ran upstairs so fast to see if he was okay. My dad told me he was fine and the door was just stuck. As he was talking to me in my room, I just felt like looking into that window, and what I saw was dreadful. It was that dark figure standing outside, looking through the window directly at me, and I screamed so loudly that the neighbors could hear it. My dad rushed to me and didn't see anything. I told him something was there, but he just couldn't see it, and then the figure vanished. No one believes me to this day, but I'm glad we finally and unexpectedly moved out of that creepy house.